Good evening, everyone joining us here in Malaysia, and a special hello to everyone else tuning in from different parts of the world. Welcome to the latest in the Urban Financing series of webinars, a result of a partnership between Think City and GDI. My name is Duncan from the Think City Institute, which is a knowledge repository and capacity building organization established by Think City. Whilst based in Malaysia, we have an international outlook, looking to solve urban problems with our partners based around the world to apply best practice to real life situations. Our series has addressed a number of different aspects of urban financing, such as how we might make our projects more attractive to investors, to the challenges that city leaders face in financing sustainable development. And today we're going to be looking at how a city can create and measure SDG impacts. As I mentioned, this webinar series is the result of a partnership between GDI and Think City. GDI, Global Development Incubator, create new approaches to address persistent global issues. They're an incubator for transformational development ventures, and they work to build and scale the next generation of social impact solutions. They match ambitious leaders, strong concepts, and capital with the executional power required to launch and scale transformational development ventures. Think City is a social purpose organization based in Malaysia with the mission of making cities more people-friendly, resilient, and livable. As a regional city-making agency, Think City provides urban policy thinking, management, and implementation of urban solutions, while acting as a catalyst for change in the way cities are planned, curated, developed, and celebrated. Today, I'm delighted to be with three speakers representing three organizations who are joining us from three different continents. Our first speaker is Dyfed Aubrey, who is dialing in from Nairobi, Kenya, who is an interregional advisor with UN Habitat. Our second is Wadzi Katsidzira, who joins us from Perth, Australia, who is an initiative lead for the Cities Investment Advisory Platform at GDI. And our third is Ahila Ganasan, the Special Projects Lead at Think City, based in Georgetown. For some basic housekeeping, our format will be very short presentations from our speakers, followed by something like a roundtable discussion, which will give everyone plenty of time to ask questions. So please let us know which speaker the question is for when you post it. And even if you don't have a question, please join the conversation in the chat box and also let us know where you're listening in from. Before we go on, if you have connection problems, click the reconnect button at the top of the page. And if you still have problems, then try refreshing your browser and you'll be brought back into the room. Our first speaker today is Dyfed Aubrey from UN Habitat. He provides high-level policy advice to governments and UN country teams globally on sustainable urban development issues. He also coordinates UN Habitat's sub-program, Enhanced Shared Prosperity of Cities and Regions, and he co-leads UN Habitat's new flagship programs, SDG Cities and Inclusive Cities. Welcome, Dyfed. Thanks for joining us again today. If you can switch on your camera and your microphone, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Duncan, and great to be joining you again. Yeah, what we're talking about impact according to what standard, and we use within the UN system the SDGs. This is our model. This is what we want to achieve against in the 10 years that we have remaining until 2030. UN Habitat is the UN agency that deals with cities and human settlements, and so naturally we're looking at how SDGs are implemented in cities. I'll just dive into the slides. The key thing for us is to understand where cities are now and where they want to be in 10 years' time. And so often cities don't plan that far in advance. Often cities are planning around 4-year cycles, 5-year cycles, according to how long a mayor is in position for. And we're encouraging cities to look 10 years ahead. Where do they want to be by 2030? Why? Because that gives us a city a good time frame to be able to get in place what's needed, the key capacities needed in urban management, etc., to be able to drive the changes that they need. So we try to envisage this in a way like a wheel. For instance, at the center of the wheel, there's 0% achievement. And if we see the rim of the wheel as 100% achievement, all the spokes are different SDG targets and indicators, then probably very few cities will reach that goal of 100% achievement by 2030. But what they can do, they can bring communities together and start planning. Where do they want to be? What are the key issues of the city? Is poverty an issue? Is green livable space, is a public space an issue? Is air quality an issue? What are the issues? Walkability, what are the issues of the city? And to try and map that then against the SDGs so that we can then report on targets, so we can sort of start comparing one city to another if that's what is needed by the country. And then once you start planning where you want to be by 2030 and mapping that against SDGs, then we need to start thinking about, well, what are the interventions needed to achieve this? And there'll be policies, there'll be strategies, there'll be the kind of soft works, but there'll also be hardware. There'll be, what investments needed, like bus rapid transit or a leisure complex or landscaping or what's improved street lighting, and trying to see how these interventions will progress you towards that plan. And so once you have a baseline, once you have targets, it's very important that projects you're able to use projects, and you're able to have a way of assessing how those projects are going to get you closer to where you want to be. Within the SDG Cities Programme, we have sort of 5 steps. The key there, to begin with, is the data. And this can be statistical data, but we're increasingly looking at citizen-generated data. How do people feel about the city? And how does that contribute to then a strategic plan? So a strategic plan is not just a wish list, it has to be evidence-driven as well. But it has to be engaging with people and stakeholders. And then moving that into spatial planning, and then identification of projects and project financing. So you can see why we're looking at a 10-year time frame, because these things take a while. At the same time, we're constantly building the capacity of government, local government and urban management issues, such as urban planning, inclusive governance, financing, etc. But what we also will be introducing is an idea of an SDG Cities certificate. So a city can be recognized for its achievement of SDGs, and this will be a UN SDG certification. So once you have the landscape of the city, where your city wants to be, the project assessment then is something which is key. As I mentioned, we've recently developed a SDG project assessment tool, and this looks at projects from a number of sustainable development perspectives. These perspectives can be sort of looked at in 2 categories. One, technical drivers, including social inclusion, spatial planning, environmental sustainability and resilience, and economic development. How does the project contribute to these? Because each of these areas, each of these drivers can be linked then to SDGs depending on the nature of the project, whether it's a transportation project or a housing project or a public space project. And then we look at not only the technical drivers, but the effectiveness drivers. Is the project driven by data? Is the project accompanied by a parallel process of building capacity and market maturity of the city? Because for the project to be well sustained, it needs to be that the city needs to be mature and ready to receive these sort of projects and maintain and implement them effectively. What are the governance and legal frameworks surrounding the project's implementation, and what are the financial strategies for its sustainability? So these are some of the sort of checklists, the project assessment tool, the tool that we do, and this is really to ensure that projects are really delivering against the ambitions of the city. But we want to go a step further, and we really appreciate the work that UNDP is doing, and we'll hear from them next week, actually, about the SDG Impact Standards. Because if we could go from an assessment to standards, then we'll really be able to record how our projects actually achieving the SDGs, and we'll have standards against that. At the moment, the UNDP has standards on SDG Impact Standards on enterprises, private equity funds, SDG bonds. And we're starting to ask the question, what would SDG standards for projects look like? And can they be universal? I'll leave you then with that question and give the floor back to Duncan. Over.
Thank you so much, Dyfed. You've raised some interesting points there, and please do stay with us so that you can join the panel discussion and we can ask those questions of you. Our next speaker is Wadzi Katsidzira. At Global Development Incubator, Wadzi works on multi-stakeholder initiatives in financing and system change in sectors including infrastructure, SME development, modern slavery, and education. She currently manages the day-to-day design and implementation of the city's investment advisory platform. Hi, Wadzi. Lovely to have you joining us again this evening.
Hi, Duncan. Thanks so much for that intro. So as Duncan mentioned, the initiative that I work on at Global Development Incubator is the city's investment advisory platform. For those who've joined this webinar before, it is our initiative in partnership with UN Habitat, Think City, and a number of others that is focused on increasing the pipeline of bankable projects in the sector that we're calling sustainable infrastructure. And we're very excited about this particular edition of the webinar, where we're really drilling into what is the sustainable component of the infrastructure piece of sustainable infrastructure. For those who've joined prior editions of this webinar, we've talked a lot and focused around the financing component. So delighted that in our session today, as well as the follow-on session next week, we're really going to be drilling in on the sustainable component of it. So what is sustainable infrastructure? There actually isn't a universally agreed upon definition of sustainable infrastructure. And so I'll ask our audience, if you can just type in the chat box, what does sustainable infrastructure mean to you? That would be great, and I'll come back to that at the end of my slides. I've put on this first slide here the OECD definition of it, and the OECD defines sustainable urban infrastructure as infrastructure that throughout its life cycle provides environmental, social, and economic benefits. And the life cycle of infrastructure is everything from planning all the way through to construction, operation, and then also a phase that's sometimes overlooked, the decommissioning phase. What are some other attributes of what we're defining as sustainable infrastructure? Well, in addition to really that comprehensive look at providing environmental, social, and economic benefits, other attributes of sustainable infrastructure is that it has the effect of strengthening resilience, multi-hazard resilience, climate resilience, public health resilience as well. Inclusivity, so more inclusive communities, and that's linked to one of the key sustainable development goals, as well as equitable access and outcomes within a physical location. So in this context, it could be within a city. Another key attribute, and again, in the context of this discourse and discussion that we're having right now, is alignment with the sustainable development goals. So where is the landscape in terms of how we measure this component of sustainability around infrastructure? What we see is a continuum where evaluating the sustainability piece, so economic, social, and governance standards, has really evolved from corporate social responsibility, so something like akin to virtue signaling or talking about the good that the company is doing, very much on the margins, to, I would say, where we are today, which is that red box, simple checklists that are starting to move into more complex data models that have multiple variables that are included in it. And what we see the market is doing is evolving towards a more comprehensive non-financial risk evaluation. So you find, for example, there is no dispute about what financial returns on a project look like, because money is money and everybody understands that. accounting standards are accounting standards, and there's generally accepted views and ideas of what that means. But when it comes to non-financial factors, when it comes to sustainability factors and impact factors, there isn't really that convergence of what is it exactly that everybody means when they're talking about sustainability, which makes it much harder to develop a measure. I'm just going to turn off my camera to allow me to more clearly talk through this particular slide as well as the next one. So as I mentioned, we've seen an evolution rather in how the market is thinking about evaluating impact and evaluating drivers of sustainability. So very early on in the 1980s and 2000s, a few decades ago, companies started talking about this concept of corporate social responsibility, very much public relations and human relations driven approach, more cosmetic, I would say, without being unkind. At a portfolio level, managers were also starting to apply, asset managers that is, were also starting to apply negative screens to exclude sin stocks. So you start to see really exclusions in portfolios of things like tobacco, in some cases, things like alcohol, particularly from a religious perspective. We still see elements of negative screening today. A lot of asset managers are moving towards excluding oil stocks and other stocks from extractive industries, for example, from their portfolios. Towards the end of that first phase, you did start to see the rise of what was then called value-based investing, where non-financial factors informed investments, but weren't actually driving the valuation. So for example, you might find the rise of sort of impact investing as an asset class, and asset allocators were really looking at things like, well, how many jobs is this particular project creating? And I'll measure that as well as the financial returns. But it's almost a qualitative assessment of impact rather than something that feeds into a quantitative valuation. The middle era is where I would say the market is today, and I would say we've been here for the better part of the current millennium, where you start to see a shift in investor preferences, a greater focus on changing climate and a whole lot of sort of scientific evidence that starts to drive this thinking that companies, asset allocators, investors have a fiduciary responsibility to think more comprehensively about how they allocate their assets and how that drives the way the planet evolves. It's an era that's much more governed by compliance and checklist approaches, and the checklists initially are a rudimentary yes or no on an identified set of metrics, hence the ESG piece. To meet kind of baseline regulatory requirements, you're also starting to see governments require, in many cases, that projects meet certain environmental criteria, or they meet certain governance criteria, or also certain social criteria as well. And you're starting to see individual asset allocators building their own in-house teams and investing quite a lot in data analytics and building complex valuation models that allow them to put all these different metrics together. There's a proliferation as well of self-subscribing certification schemes and industry standards. So I think the ones that we would be most familiar with would be the standards in the building industry, right? So you have green certification ratings or for your appliances. And that is applied all the way across through to major infrastructure projects, where there are some varying versions, depending on the industry or on the sector, of looking at these sustainability factors as well as impact factors. What's the aspiration and what could the future look like? I think the aspiration and perhaps the gold standard, and we're starting to see, as I said, the industry moving and evolving towards that, is some sort of standardization and robust approach to how you evaluate non-financial risk factors to inform risk-return expectations. The hope is that evaluation is possible across sectors, because right now you'll find different models of assessing impact are applied across different sectors. Whereas when you look at the financial assessment, an IRR is an IRR, doesn't matter what sector you're in. Whereas in many cases, the models that have been developed to assess the impact of a project will spit out different values depending on what sector the project is in. And then we want to see, hopefully, a convergence between impact investment returns assessment as well as ESG risk evaluation. So starting to get towards a more kind of comprehensive and holistic assessment of risk and return that factors in both financial returns, but also non-financial returns. This slide talks a little bit more about the current state of play. Again, really just delving in a little bit more into what I described earlier about these broad checklists that have sometimes thousands and thousands of different criteria and the different opportunity areas across different categories. So I'll talk through it really quickly. But in each kind of case, we've broken it down using the babushka dolls: projects, companies, indices, as well as portfolios. And the market approach, I'll just describe it. But at the project level, you are seeing considerable variation by sector, with the greatest progress being on assessing against regulated environmental, social, and governance factors. So for example, if you are a UK investor, the regulations in that jurisdiction are pretty clear around governance. And so it's much easier to include those and to quantify those. They might be not as strong in other jurisdictions. Almost globally, across a number of sectors, the requirements of the guidelines around the environmental, at least at the baseline level, are also quite clear. So on a project-specific level, there really are products and services on offer that enable people to meet those standards. And that example of green buildings is one that I gave. Whereas and I've just indicated, the different example actors, again, to really hammer that point home that the current landscape for measuring impact is so varied and so divergent, which I think is how you drive innovation. But hopefully we get convergence, right? Everybody who's tinkering away in their silo, we hope that eventually we get to a point where folks are kind of coalescing towards a globally accepted universal standard. Whereas the opportunity area, I mean, Dyfed talked earlier about the work that they're doing at UN Habitat, which is very exciting, around the SDG project assessment tool, which starts to develop urban and city-specific metrics and data points that contribute to the existing models that are applied on a project-by-project basis. At a company level, what we're seeing in terms of the market approach is that there is a much greater and much more deliberate shift towards triple bottom line accounting, with inclusion in most kind of listed companies will have some more than superficial evaluation of ESG and their impact. And it's gone beyond the glossy CSR brochures of old into really how do you integrate it into business. A couple of stock exchanges across the globe have adopted a sustainability index where companies can opt in, and you're starting to see this really robust discourse and robust thinking from company leaders on how to truly integrate sustainability and concepts of sustainable development into their business model. So it's not just, okay, we're going to build a school on the side and hope the best. But if you're a financial services company, if you're a bank, how in your investment criteria and in the decisions that you make, are you driving sustainability? Again, there's a number of business benchmarking services in terms of products and services on the market. Companies can undertake some of these. The current limitation with these is they do tend to sort of be self-selecting. So you'll find a company will choose as their impact evaluate using a service that most aligns with what they're already doing, right? So not perfect, but certainly in the right direction. What's the opportunity area? Adding urban metrics specifically to existing ESG and SDG checklists. On an indus level, a number of the major ratings agencies, so I've just put a few there, have started doing impact ratings. They're based largely on sort of, not rudiment, well, they're based on simplified metrics. So it's usually like a consolidation of a number of yes/no criteria built into then what is quite a comprehensive model that then spits out a rating similar to a credit rating. And then the final piece is at the portfolio level, you are really seeing almost a privatized market with each major asset manager building and deploying their own complex model that they will use within their portfolio to assess impact. We think that the opportunity area here is to help asset allocators improve their ratings approach, again, specifically for cities, and to potentially enhance their current methodologies. So that's a sprint through where the landscape is at right now, what the opportunities areas and kind of our view on how the market shifts. I'm just going to look through the chat and see if there's anyone who offered a definition. Yeah, someone, oh, it's really quiet on the chat. Oh, someone said, oh, thank you. I see a couple of responses. Okay, so sustainable infrastructure. So Alia Shaiful, hi Alia. To me, sustainable infrastructure focuses on infrastructure that provides the same or more utility over the years. The ability also be built without causing environmental, social, or economic harm. That makes a lot of sense. Natalie says, sustainable infrastructure is able to create long-lasting social impact, social, economic, and environmental growth. It is also accessible to all. Great. Thank you so much for all of those responses. I will hand over to Duncan.
Thanks so much, Wadzi. I really appreciate your time this evening. And don't forget, everyone, you can still ask questions for Dyfed, Wadzi, and Ahila in the chat box. Please do ask questions because it'll make the chat at the end of the session even more interesting. So I turn to our final speaker, who is Ahila Ganasan, and she's a professional architect by training who has 2 decades of experience as a consultant architect and leader in property development for multi-billion-dollar Malaysian and international projects. As Special Projects Lead at Think City, she helms the business and strategic planning for the Penang Bay project to develop a new economic zone for the Malaysian state of Penang. Good evening, Ahila. Thank you for joining us from Penang.
Hi, thanks.
I turn over to you.
Yep, thank you. It's good to be here. What Dyfed and Wadzi have just said, it's a great way to segue to what I want to bring about today and what I want to talk about today, which is sort of a combination between the SDG Cities assessment tools and guidelines, as well as the impact measurements that Wadzi was mentioning earlier. So I will take you to my first slide, which is a beautiful picture of Penang Bay. Since we have a global audience here, so there's just a bit of a geography lesson. Penang is a state in the northern part of Peninsular Malaysia in Southeast Asia. And currently, what we are looking at is trying to create a new economic zone in this area that you see in this picture. Let me go to my next slide. So here's the thing. If you look at the top left corner, that's where Penang State is, and the red box defines what Penang Bay is. So essentially what we are trying to do here is to look at how it envisions a creation of a new economic zone that stresses a strong vision and a holistic plan for catalyzing large-scale change. So Think City, in partnership with the state government, hopes to work to renew Penang's urban core by bringing life back to its historical, natural, water-based assets in order to enable people and capital to invest in a new city, where culture, nature, business, and technology are organized symbiotically. So what you see here, if you look at this little map on the top right, that's Penang Bay. So it encompasses the island part of it as well as the mainland part. So what you see is this hourglass shape from the north of the Penang Bridge right up to the northern tip here called Tanjung Tokong. So that entire place here is what we refer to as Penang Bay. Now, if you look at a bit of background as to what Penang has gone through throughout the decades and years, it started off as a port city with trade and agriculture between the 1700s right up to 1969, at which point it went through a loss of its free port status that led to a very high unemployment. So there was a concentrated effort by the state government to pivot the state's economy towards a high-tech and manufacturing and mass tourism hub, which made it an industrial city starting in the 1970s right up to now. But with the COVID-19 pandemic currently, it's time for another pivot. This is the way we look at it, another pivot where we see that COVID-19 has greatly impacted our tourism in general, and we rely a lot on tourism. So there needs to be another pivot, and what we want to go towards is a resilient city. So a bit of quick facts about Penang Bay. It's got about 2,000 acres of industrial land, 30 kilometers of coastline, 1,800 acres of potential development area on the island, another 3,000 acres of potential development land on the mainland, and it's also home to Georgetown, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So if you look at this, when we talk about Penang Bay and how we would like to create a new economic zone, in sort of also looking at how it will become a resilient city and compliant to SDGs, it is not a journey that started recently. If you look at the bottom part of the slide here, you notice that the journey for Penang Bay started way back in 2007. I'm going to turn off my camera here so you can see more of the slide. So essentially, it started in 2007, and every year we've been inching closer and closer to what we consider as Penang Bay today. In earlier part of this year, in February, we actually went to the World Urban Forum, and our plans or our proposal and vision for Penang Bay was very well received. And as such, the state has decided to propel it forward and see how well we can actually pivot into a more resilient city. So if you look at this, again, at the top right, that's the hourglass shape of Penang Bay. And I'd like to draw your attention to Penang 2030, which is a goal that the state envisions, where they are trying to create, like what Dyfed was saying earlier, sort of a roadmap for 10 years, rather than a planning for 5 years or 4 years, but a 10-year plan to get there towards an SDG compliant city. And all of this is done with dovetailing with the Sustainable Development Goals. So if you look at these themes that we have across the board, theme A to D, these are all part of the 2030 goals in Penang. And each one of this sort of links to part of the development goals that we envision for Penang Bay. Of course, the 2030 document is a lot more exhaustive, and it runs the whole gamut of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But in this case, for Penang Bay, these are the specific Sustainable Development Goals that we are trying to focus on. If you look at it, addressing affordable housing and diversity, to continue improving public safety and cleanliness, diversify recreation, and that's all part of theme A, which also is part of sustainable cities and communities. Similarly, when you look at theme B, C, and D, you can see that it clearly also dovetails with various, not just one, but sometimes 2 or 3 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the key part that I'd like to address here is that with creating a new economic zone, one of the key things is looking at investors. So what Wadzi was saying earlier is really crucial. With the push for ESG, a lot of investors are looking for places to invest their money or go into, which is economically viable as well as compliant with ESG. And this pivot by most organizations is actually an impetus for us to also move in that direction. Now, of course, Penang Bay is only a part of it. It's only this little hourglass shape, but we envision that this ripple effect will eventually go statewide, and you're going to have a lot of other areas which are going to be SDG compliant and possibly with SDG certification, SDG Cities certification, as what Dyfed was saying. And with that, I would like to hand it back to Duncan. Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you so much, Ahila. If you'd like to switch on your camera, and I'd also like to invite our 2 other speakers, Wadzi and Dyfed, to join us back for the Q&A session. Thank you, everyone. So thank you, everyone, for good presentations. And I've been looking through the comments that have come in from the chat box, and I think I'd like to get back to basics. So we've all heard about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think all of us listening, we have an understanding or we think we have an understanding what sustainability actually means. Yep, we're having this webinar. So what exactly is the difficulty in measuring SDG impacts? So perhaps I could start with you, Dyfed.
Okay, thanks, Duncan. Yeah, there are a number, but I would say there's three sort of predominant challenges. I think one is quite often we don't have a baseline to start with, so we can only measure progress if we knew where we started from. So having that baseline data is key to be able to measure achievement. Also, impacts in urban development take time. You know, they take sometimes several years, 5 years, even 10 years to really see the impact of interventions. And quite often we haven't really built in, or a city hasn't really built in that sort of plan to have that evaluation of a project in 5 years or 10 years time. So sometimes we just move on to the next thing and we don't sort of step back and give a long-term evaluation. And I think the third challenge then is the attributability, because quite often a number of things contribute to one major impact. If we're talking about, say, social inclusion or sustainable economic development, what can you attribute to your particular project, and what are the other things which are attributed? So I think attributability is quite a hard word to pronounce and quite a challenge. Over.
So Wadzi, maybe I can turn to you based on what Dyfed has said. And, you know, you're from a financial background. So from the perspective of a city in a developing country, why go down the path of sustainability? Why not just leave that to the richer countries to do? You know, it's difficult finding investment, and you know, we need to make sustainable projects more sexy, I suppose, for investors. So why even go down the path of sustainability for infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things that is becoming almost indisputable is that you really can't take the sustainability component away from how you think about development. It's almost imperative for both developing and developed countries to think about these things and to factor them in. The challenge is even bigger. I mean, the challenge is different in developing countries from what it is in developed countries, but the challenge in developing countries is that developing countries are urbanizing at the fastest rate. They have the greatest need for infrastructure. So there's something like a $3 to $4 trillion infrastructure financing gap every year, depending on whose number you use. And more than half of that is in developing countries. And what are things like infrastructure? It's things like transport. It's things like water and sanitation systems. It's things like housing. And you have a situation in which, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, the population is urbanizing at the fastest rate in the world. More and more people, something like 3 million people a week, are moving into cities. And they're moving into areas where they're demanding high quality services. They're looking for good jobs, and that has to be done in a sustainable way, in the sense that the resources that you use to make the infrastructure, to build the houses, has to be high quality, has to last, has to serve a huge number of people. And then also it needs to meet their needs. So it's almost a fallacy to have some sort of expectation that we can continue to build infrastructure without thinking about the non-financial impacts and the non-financial factors that are driving it. And I think that's why we're having this discussion today, because more and more people are recognizing that it's necessary to focus on it. And the key question, it was kind of Dyfed was describing, is what is the attribution, right? I think that's the hardest thing with non-financial returns. The hardest thing with impact is what are you measuring? How are you measuring it? Who is responsible for delivering it? Which is the big challenge within cities and within urban areas. Whose job is it to make sure that the right set of materials are used? Whose job is it to make sure that the highway doesn't lead to cutting down lots of different trees? What's more important, a particular type of tree or a particular set of social objectives? Those are all the factors and the things that need to be put in. But I think the indisputable factor is that we do have to think about sustainability, and we do have to factor that into how we assess projects.
Thanks, Wadzi. Ahila, so I'd like to turn to you and talk in terms of the Penang Bay project. based on what he said in terms of developing countries, so Malaysia is a middle-income country, but has many of the same issues that we see in developing countries, like very rapid urbanization. Sure. What key things does the Penang Bay project require to ensure that the SDG impacts are achieved?
I think it goes back to the measurement tools, because essentially we are trying to create a new economic zone. But with a new economic zone, you need to bring in investors. So with investors, the thing that they would demand is, how do you measure this? How do you measure the impact that you're having with being a SDG compliant city, or Penang Bay being SDG compliant? Why would we invest here unless you give us a proper measurement tool? So when I look at what Dyfed has been saying with SDG cities and the possibility of having a measurement tool, I think that's very encouraging, because I think that's essentially what we need right now. And with what Wadzi is saying as well, it goes back to ESG. With corporate governance and the fact that investors are looking for that. And the other thing is that when we talk about stakeholder engagement, it also dovetails again with what Wadzi said about the communities. Penang specifically has a very, I would say, very enlightened, is very enlightened in terms of the way people think and how passionate they are about the environment as well as SDGs. So in that sense, the community also demands a more sustainable way of addressing the issues in Penang and how any development is done in Penang. And we believe that Penang Bay will be able to deliver that, not just to investors, but deliver that to the government as well to the communities. Now, we already have got one key thing. We've got the buy-in from the state government, which is why Think City is working together with the state government as a delivery partner, in a partnership to deliver this Penang Bay. So that's already one part of it, which is already a key area that we have satisfied. Now we really need to look at the investor and how measuring this would actually encourage investors to come in, especially the kind of investors that we want to propel us into Industry 4.0 or a more resilient city.
Thanks, Ahila. So all three of you have mentioned measurement. So I guess that's where I should be heading. Dyfed, one of the things that you sort of alluded to was about having, standards, universal standards. And Wadzi mentioned that something along the lines of, we have standards for green buildings and green appliances, but, we don't have standards for bridges or metro systems about how green they are. So is it even possible for us to have universal standards, Dyfed?
I think so. At the moment, UN Habitat's embarking on a initiative across the UN system to have in place a global urban monitoring framework. And we have at the moment many cities starting to report annually on what's called a voluntary local review. And because cities have started to do this, basically national governments are encouraged to do this under the SDGs. Now cities are jumping in and saying, we want to do the same. And so in the process of looking at guidelines for voluntary local review, and also because different entities have different ways to measure progress in cities, we've started to work on a universal or a global urban monitoring framework. And I think what's key then, and that needs to assess cities, but then it needs to cascade then down to the level of projects, so the projects can report against how it's doing in terms of the city's plan. And as you're in Penang, this urban monitoring framework draws reference from the City Prosperity Initiative, which is something which is being undertaken in Penang. And what's key, I think, is universally we can set principles, we can set aspirations, and when we talk about the key issues of environmental sustainability, this is a universal concept. Social inclusion is a universal concept. Prosperity, the understanding of shared prosperity, is a universal concept. Now, how it plays out into projects and specifics and its various attributes probably then need to be set at the national level. For instance, in the UK, where I'm from, if we're talking about environmental sustainability, I remember being an architect using the building regulations, and there were very specific requirements against thermal performance of buildings. Now, those would not be relevant in other climates. So there's a need then to take global principles and global indicators and then look at what are they, and then to derive from that national or local indicators against that. That's my view of how to have a universal yet locally specific way of measuring cities and projects.
Wadzi, would you agree with that? That Dyfed said that you can have universal standards, but they're kind of set locally.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think what Dyfed is saying is grounded in precedent, right? Which is how a lot of standards and a lot of kind of benchmarks are cascaded, where there's a globally accepted and a globally adopted sort of umbrella standard, and then that's localized and cascaded down to different levels. I think what I will add is that we've talked a lot in this webinar about the Sustainable Development Goals. What is particularly exciting and galvanizing about the Sustainable Development Goals are that we have in them a really unifying, globally accepted standard right now of how we're starting to talk about sustainability, and that's globally accepted across all spheres. So you have a number of different players in the private sector talking and engaging about the Sustainable Development Goals. You have folks in the UN system who are the kind of the custodians of the SDGs also talking about it. You have governments talking about it. So they really give us this opportunity to have this shared language, because everything is kind of in a position where we're deriving potentially from that umbrella standard, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, and then you build off the basis of that and localize, as Dyfed has said.
And Ahila, can you think of some measurement tools that might be useful for you for the Penang Bay project? Is there any sort of methodology or tool that you feel that is missing specifically for you?
Honestly, when going back to what Dyfed and Wadzi was saying, talking about a global standard which is then localized, I think that's important. But I think when it comes to methodology, Duncan, the way I look at it, it needs to still be accepted by the investors. Now, a lot of the times the investors are not local. So if we localize this, the danger could be that they don't recognize it, because a lot of the companies might want to recognize something that is more global. So I would put a little bit of a caution as to whether that is the right way to go, simply because at the end of the day, we are trying to attract people from all over the globe. So in that sense, I would say you might want to tweak certain things which are local, probably the social aspects of it. That makes sense. But some of the key areas, the bigger ones that investors would want to look at, I think that would have to be tailored on a global basis in terms of a methodology. So it kind of like, it depends. Honestly, it depends on what SDG you're referring to.
I think that's an interesting point. I mean, we're all familiar with the ISO series that sets standards for various industries. And, the capital markets, they're global. So wouldn't it make sense for, some sort of global impact measurement of sustainability? I give this either to Wadzi or Dyfed, who feels brave.
Yeah, right. I think some definitions need to be global. But I think they absolutely need to be interpreted locally, because there's such specificities at cities. For instance, if I was to say, is air conditioning? Should a building have air conditioning? Yes or no? And have that as a standard. No air conditioning equals environmental performance. Well, it depends on how the electricity is generated and all sorts of other things. So if we jump straight into global specifics, we could get trapped and we might find the standards are not working for us. If we have global standards, but its measurement is based scientifically on the local situation, yet it's achieving the overall objective, I think that's possible. This is where I sort of step back into my architect shoes and say, this is an area which I'm not specialist in, I must admit. But we do have in Habitat colleagues who can sort of understand that landscape between what could be defined as global standards and how they're measured, and how it's measured in a relevant way locally, and measured in a way whereby a small city in a developing context could do equally well as a city in a high-income context. So we also need to look at this. We also need to be able to not link our standards too much to the prosperity of cities and the ability, the resources that they have to implement there. I think we need to have standards which where secondary cities in developing contexts can really shine. And this is something that we also need to be considering when we're looking at standards and how they're measured.
Okay. I'm going to take a question now from our audience. This is from Ahila Ganasan, and her question is, how would private-public partnerships impact be measured in terms of building sustainable cities? Also, what are the incentives for private sectors to support sustainability efforts? I think this sounds like a Wadzi question.
Great, thank you for that question. So the first part about how our public-private partnerships, PPP, is assessed in terms of an impact perspective. The general answer is that it really varies depending on the legislation in the country. But if you look at public-private partnerships, the public component, generally speaking, governments have historically been the custodians of all aspects of sort of public sector service delivery and public infrastructure delivery, inclusive of the government mandate being in service to society and in service to the holistic well-being of the community. And so in that vein, what you'll find is that a lot of public-private partnerships, again, it depends on the legislation in the country, will include within them a number of assessments that have sustainability enshrined in them. So there might be certain very clearly stipulated expectations on social factors, governance factors, environmental factors, very particular requirements within that. Now, whether or not they sort of conform to the universally accepted notion of good or if they're ideal is a question for subjective value judgment, but certainly within the PPP framework, looking at that is something that is kind of already factored in and thought about as a high level kind of first response. And Duncan, remind me the second question, please.
The second half was, what are the incentives for private sector to support sustainability efforts?
Yeah, I think the incentives are staying in business. It really is kind of as simple as that, right? So there's a lot of momentum across a number of different spheres. One is that certain business models may no longer be viable outside of that. Another is shifting consumer preferences. So if you look across different private sector industries, there are different factors driving change. For example, in the asset management industry, so a subsector of the financial services industry, particularly around private equity, a lot of what started to drive some of the large-scale change was millennials moving into positions of controlling wealth, and millennials having perspectives where they wanted to see more triple bottom line accounting, more inclusion of sustainability factors. But as you start to see generational shift, you start to see consumers of multiple levels demand different things. And unless you're catering to that, you're simply no longer able to stay in business. And then when you look at, with the Cities Investment Advisory Platform, we spend a lot of time engaging with various parts of the private sector. We engage a lot with engineering services, for example, businesses, as well as advisory services across a range of infrastructure components and feasibility studies and things like that. invariably they are looking to evolve their businesses because they're looking ahead and they're saying that in 20 years time or in 30 years time, the effects of climate change are going to start to be much more marked. They need to be thinking about different types of materials. They need to be revising what kind of mathematical models they use. So the traditional models that they've used for assessing, how a building will degrade over time no longer apply because the climate is changing in less predictable patterns. So how do you shift your business so that you stay relevant for the industries of the future, So I think the rallying call and the imperative for the private sector is that you either adapt or you go out of business in one way or another.
So based on that, yes, Dyfed, please go ahead.
Yeah, just an example. And 20 years ago, when Generation X people were business leaders, I was working in the UK in architectural practice, and we had the BREEAM rating, which was a kind of a voluntary rating for environmental performance of buildings. Now, a lot of clients would be asking for an outstanding level, even though the building regulations would be equivalent to a good rating. A lot of clients, and our clients were generally commercial, mixed-use development type clients, because they were seeing that the market, the buildings are going to be a lot more marketable if they can say that this has got an outstanding environmental performance, because those commercial enterprises renting those buildings could also benefit from the fact that they are in an environmentally an outstanding building. So I think what we found, it shifted from the local governments and the building regulations telling clients what they had to respond to and what they had to comply with, to clients taking that and those developers taking that standard higher because it meant something to them. And for their business, they saw the value. Over.
Thanks, Dyfed. So it seems to me from what you're saying that it still comes down quite a great deal to the decision maker in an organization wanting to do that, having that part of their brain or their heart that cares about these issues. So what do we do about the CEO of the company that couldn't give a toss? All he cares about is getting his newest Ferrari or Mercedes with next year's bonus. Can we bring them in? Ahila, what do you think?
Very interesting question. I think that you will find those CEOs are going to be they're going to be a prehistoric being eventually, because it's not going to stand. You've got the Greta Thunbergs of the world that are going to demand change, and that's the way the direction is going. It's not just a checklist anymore, like what Wadzi was showing with the 3 columns. While it's remained in the red box for a while, it's actually moving towards the next level, and you're going to find that there is a demand from consumers, from the community, to move in the direction of going towards sustainability and being more resilient. And if anything, the pandemic has ensured that that you have no choice. So essentially, I don't think it's just a matter of time. I don't think they have a choice. I agree with Wadzi completely here. It's to stay in business. If you want to stay in business, you got to toe the line. If not, you're out.
Well, thank you for that, Ahila. I see it's 9 o'clock, which means that we're our time is up. So I think we have one last question, and it actually relates precisely to what the three of you have just been talking about. And it comes from Chin Hui, and he says, I think it's a he or she, would like to hear some thoughts on how sustainable development and circular economy can converge. I assume you're all familiar with the concept of the circular economy. Put your hand up if you're not, and I won't ask you this question. Wadzi, you're not.
I mean, I have a vague notion, so I can make some stuff up, but let me be honest.
You can also use this opportunity to wrap up your thoughts for the evening as well. Wadzi, would you like to go first, or?
Yeah, sure. And then we can go back to the wonderful question on the circular economy. I mean, I think the thing to say is the thing that Ahila ended with, which is A lot of exciting momentum. Business imperative is to change or be a dinosaur and go extinct. Good news is that there's a framework for doing that with the SDGs, and I'll plug our next session next Tuesday, where we'll talk a little bit more about the SDG impact.
Thanks, Wadzi. Dyfed, last thoughts? So you need to turn on your microphone.
So yeah, I'm not an expert on the circular economy. I hear about it quite a lot when we're talking about waste management, for instance, and how something which is consumed and disposed can then be utilized, recycled, used, provide value somewhere before it's then taken to the next stage. So it's about a value chain, I think, and I think I'm not an expert in this area, but I think the principle being that you don't dispose, you utilize, and you pass this over to another piece of the value chain that can take that issue and that potential further. I think this is key, because I think it's about the continuous value chain, and we do need to explore how our segment of the economy and what it produces and what it disposes of can be an asset to another segment of the economy. So I think this needs to be understood better by myself, obviously, but I think this discussion is a key entry point for that discourse on sustainable development. I don't think I've answered very well. Maybe Ahila will do better.
Well, I think that I have a slightly different view. I think the Sustainable Development Goals already address the circular economy. I don't think that it is not without that. If you look at the goals, they're quite varied, and they cover quite a lot of ground. So as far as I'm concerned, it's already converged. It's not something that is running separately. So that's my take on it, actually.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I thought Chinwe was going to get the prize for tonight for stumping everybody, but Ahila came to the rescue. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in.
You're most welcome.
So I'm afraid that's all the time. And thanks everyone for your comments in the chat box. And thank you to our three speakers, Dyfed, Wadzi, and Ahila. I appreciate you taking the time to join us and share your insights.
Thank
so
you,
we're going to be having our next webinar, which is going to be on the 17th, which is next week. And we're going to be looking at sustainable finance for sustainable cities. And we're going to be looking at it from the perspective of finance institutions. So I hope you can join us for that. We have from the UN Development Programme, Elizabeth Boggs-Davidson, and from CIMB here in Malaysia, we have Luan Xie. And my colleague Natalie O will be moderating that next week. So I look forward to that. So until next time, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And I will say goodbye.